Welcome to Deep Dive. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict, and I want to thank everyone out there for joining us today. I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine, an expert in his field, Matthew David. Thanks for joining us, Matthew.
Kevin, it is great to be here. Thank you for inviting me onto your show.
Absolutely. So, I really focus on kind of three different categories of guests on this show. There's business experts. That includes, the marketing and all kinds of business side of the business. Then there are technology experts that are leading, it could be even thousands of developers within their organization. And then I look for, and one of my favorite categories is that of the expert. And today I'm bringing you Matthew David, a true expert in a number of fields, the authors of multiple books, Matthew David, and he works for Accenture. He works for Accenture, and if I got your title right, Digital Senior Manager, is that how it works?
Yep, yeah, you got the title right, and I feel like I'm blushing as you're introducing me right now.
All right, well, good. So I'm doing a good job here. So Matthew, talk to us about what books have you authored today?
Sure. So, gosh, well, I wrote my first. I've always been very interested in writing, so this was not something that was that happened by accident. It was something that always interested me, even as a teenager. I enjoyed writing, and I was absolutely convinced I was going to become a professional writer, a published poet, and that was the direction I was going to go until I actually published my first poem and actually got $0 for it. So lots of kudos. But not a lot of when you have a young family, there isn't a way to be able to keep the family sustained. And so it happened to be that this was the mid-1990s, and I was I'd gotten very closely involved with what was happening with early web technologies and was riding that wave. And I had been following a company called Future Splash, which later became the Macromedia Flash technology, which then became Adobe Flash technology.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed the technology. I could see where it was going. I knew the limitations that we had with the web at the time, and Macromedia went ahead and made the bold move of buying Future Splash and then creating a slew of web-friendly products. And so we had Flash, we had Dreamweaver, and we had Fireworks, which was kind of like this holy triumvirate of technologies that early web developers had. And as those programs were coming out and getting ready for pre-release, I was already having chats with Macromedia and saying, hey, I want to get involved with the beta program. It's really easy to get involved with beta programs with companies. I mean, you just ask and they're like, well, we're not going to pay you. And you go, oh, that's okay. I just want to get access to the software early. And they're like, right, we'll sign you up. And so I got signed up and ended up meeting a great guy, Joe Lowry, who wrote the first Dreamweaver Bible. And unfortunately, one of his relatives died as he was halfway through the Bible, and he reached out to the group and said, look, I need somebody to write 1 or 2 chapters. We have this, death in the family.
Yeah.
And I kind of stuck my hand in the air, and that's really become my my lesson to myself, which is whenever anybody offers something, even if you don't know if you can do it, you just stick your hand in the air. And so I ended up. Yeah, I went from writing 1 chapter to I wrote 6 or 7 chapters, which was about a quarter of the book. And from that, my name kind of got around, and so I ended up writing over the next year. I contributed chapters to over 20 books, pretty much every major publisher, and all on web technologies. And then I started realizing I really would like to write my own book, and I'd written a chapter for Flash MX Magic, which was really the first book that talked about how to use Flash, but from a scripting point of view. And I wrote a chapter on how to create basic form controls, and it was one of those things where it kind of kept sticking with me. I'm like, there's a lot we could do with this space. And so I went back to New Riders. I said, I think we could do a new book on the new version of Flash that was coming out. It has a much more robust scripting language. We can do a lot more stuff with it.
Yeah.
And so we went ahead, and I reached out to a bunch of my friends, and I said, "Hey, we can pay you $750, but we need you to write one chapter." And so we actually did that, and we put the book together, and it became a bestseller. And I think we ended up selling, I don't know how many thousands of copies, but it did very, very well.
Well,
And,
that's terrific, Matthew. So I can see how this interview is going to go. I'm going to ask you how many books you wrote, and you're going to tell me a story.
I am a story guy.
Okay, I see how this works. Hey, but I don't. I think before we started recording here, you said you were in Wisconsin, right in the center of the Arctic Vortex. But that accent, I'm not great at accents, but that doesn't sound like a Wisconsin accent.
No. I'm originally from the UK, born and raised in England. I lived just north of London for many, many years, and then I lived in the northeast of England, which is just a fantastic place. Yeah. And then in college, I had an opportunity to come study abroad, and I was putting myself through college, and I was like, yeah, I'd love to go study in America. And they told me how much it was going to be. I'm like, can't afford that. It's really expensive. Yeah, but then I saw in small print that there was a Plan B program, which was to a few very limited schools, but it was like a third of the price. Yeah. And it actually worked out that it was cheaper for me to come study here for a year than staying in England. And
wow, so and you said, where can I study, which would be right under the Arctic Vortex?
Yeah, that was pretty much it. I said, I had, as a little kid, I'd lived in Flint, Michigan, and I said, I want to go to the nearest place to Flint, Michigan. They said, well, we have a partnership with UW Milwaukee. Do you want to go there? I said, yes, sign me up. They said, do you even know where Milwaukee is? I'm like, I don't. And 6 weeks later, I was in Milwaukee, and 3 days after that, I met the girl I was destined to marry. And so I've been here now for 25 years.
Matthew, you're the first person I've ever met that as a goal in life, you wanted to move to Flint, Michigan.
I know. And I actually worked in Detroit a few years ago. I worked for a company in Detroit for a number of years and drove by Flint. And my memories of Flint as a kid are just fantastic. It was the heyday, and it was just a great place. And unfortunately, it's fallen on rough times. But I'm hoping it comes back.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into technology. You're a big enterprise mobility guy. You've written on it. It looks like you might even have instructed classes involving how to develop mobile apps and all that kind of fun stuff. How have you seen it evolve in 60 seconds? No, let's say in 120 seconds. How have you seen it evolve, Matthew?
So it's evolved dramatically. I wrote my first white paper for Adobe back in 2002 on taking Flash Lite at the time and making it so it could run on Docomo devices in Japan. Very limited experience, very similar to the Java experience on mobile devices. That was interesting, but the big push really came with the iPhone and Android phones, and it was more around 2009, 2010, where you could actually start building applications. And the big opportunity that got presented was that you could actually write really full applications. And we're going through, I think, kind of the second evolution of mobile applications on devices right now. if we look at the new iPad Pro that Apple launched, it's a top tier device, but
Yeah,
in 2 years' time, that will be just the standard device, whether it's on a phone or whether it's a tablet. And what's really interesting about it is just the sheer power, both from the CPU, the GPU, and now the machine learning chips that are
yeah,
built into these devices. The processing power is just stunning. But then you complement that with all the sensors between your Apple Watch. There's rumors that the new AirPods will actually have a temperature sensor built into them. You
wow.
combine all of that. We're creating a world where we're surrounding ourselves with data that we can actually do something meaningfully with. And I think that's going to be the real next evolution, is like, how do we take these smart computers that we carry with us to actually being devices that actually dramatically improve our lifestyle.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And you talked about sensors there. You've jumped in with both feet into the Internet of Things world as
Mm-hmm.
well. How are you seeing that evolve, and where are we today with that?
Sure. So I kind of joke that the Android phones and iPhones were really the first Internet of Things devices, and a lot of the technology you see in those devices really have extrapolated out into what we call IoT. I got involved with IoT when it was referred to as machine to machine,
Yes,
and
India.
yeah, I led a team that was working with a large auto company to actually create a smart car and being able to take information from the car back to the automaker, and then send information out to the customer saying, hey, you want to get your tires replaced in maybe 3 weeks time, or you want me to go ahead and schedule time
Right.
to get your changed. And that was like 4 or 5 years ago. What we've seen in the last few years is kind of the Gartner hype cycle for IoT. Lots of promise 2 years ago, and everybody's talking about IoT. But what you always find when you get to that hype cycle is that trough of disillusionment, where everybody's like, "Well, where is my IoT world?" And I think the reality with IoT is that it never was going to be this, like, not like the when the iPhone came out. The iPhone was an event, and it just
Yeah.
took over. And yes, we had Android phones, and there's for every iPhone there's 9 Android phones sold. But it was an event activity. With IoT, it's just going to be something that just suddenly we realize everything is sensor driven, and we're going to be not even questioning it. It's not going to be whether we have a smart home or we have smart this or smart that. It's just going to be smart, and we're going to
Yes.
want to get data from it. So
Absolutely. So
lots of cool
you
stuff.
Yeah, so you've done a brilliant job throughout your career of kind of surfing that wave of emerging technologies. What are the emerging technologies that you find particularly interesting today?
Sure. So there's really three answers to that question, and it depends on where you are as a company. The reality is there's very few high tech companies out there that are cresting that emerging wave. So the reason why I say there's three is that the first wave of technologies that a lot of companies are still getting their arms around is just that mobile first wave, and while it is to a certain degree table stakes, that concept of embracing cloud, mobile and device-driven solutions, which is more of a customer experience solution, is still very fundamental. You need to kind of get your arms around that. The second wave is not so much technology, but just the culture of innovation that you want to create within your own organization. So, for instance, you see a lot of companies that are going from delivering projects as a waterfall project to agile, and they think agile is going to solve everything.
Yeah,
I'm really pushing companies to go to DevOps, because with DevOps, you kind of get the benefit of agile, but you also get that realization of the future of where technology can go, which is this instead of having big events like once a month or once every 2 weeks of a release,
yeah,
you're doing continuous releases, maybe 20, 30, or 50 releases a day, and you're constantly pushing these out, and you're creating the tools that allow your development teams to be able to build to that environment. So you're taking advantage of container technologies like Docker, and managing them in the cloud with Kubernetes. You're using Jenkins for your integration services. You're scripting out all your testing, and you're building everything so it can be scripted, and it's constantly reevaluating what you're doing. And then once you have that in place, now you can really take advantage of the new technologies such as artificial intelligence.
Wow.
I see artificial intelligence, blockchain, and augmented reality, and maybe in that order of being those emerging technologies. AI, practically you can use it right now. Blockchain, you should definitely be experimenting with the understanding that you're implementing an enterprise solution in the next 2 to 3 years. And then with artificial intelligence, augmented reality, I really see that in the next 5 years growing significantly.
Boy, that is rich content, and thank you for sharing your insights from your career and just what you're seeing coming. Fascinating. I'm so excited to see that. Now, we've all experienced digital transformation. You've been in consulting, you've been advising, you've been writing for a long time. So digital transformation's probably been around a decade or so. And, let's just make up a number. If there's 10 steps to digital transformation, what's left in most companies? Because I know a lot of companies have been involved in it, but there's still the really hard parts. What are the hard parts that still remain to be digitally transformed?
The hardest part is culture. It absolutely is, because with digital transformation, what you're doing is not just, so very often you use a shiny object saying like mobile. You say that's going to become the pivot point around which we're going to use the excuse of doing digital transformation. For me, you get to a point when you're doing your digital transformation where you realize that the technology isn't what's doing the transformation. It's your culture and the way you approach problem solving from a customer point of view that becomes the digital transformation. Because the reality is that as a company, you're already solving problems for your customer, and what you're looking to do is to get your customer to be able to solve that problem faster. And the mobile app is just a tool. It's just no different to a spade or a shovel.
Yes.
And we have thousands of digital tools. One of the best stories I heard, and I hate using technology stories, but it's a good story, is the Amazon, Jeff Bezos, Amazon's CEO. They were saying, what are you working on in the next 5 years? He said, well, I can't tell you what specifically we're working on in the next 5 years, but what I can tell you is 10 years from now, our goal is going to be exactly the same as our goal today. Is we want to be able to delight our customers with rich selection of options. We want to be able to give them the cheapest price, and we want to be able to get that product to them faster than they can get it today. Those three things are not going to change.
So it's a philosophy. It's a philosophy. It's a strategy, and the tools that will be required to accomplish that will evolve and change rapidly over time then.
Yep. I mean, you think about the last 20 years, just the rapid amount of change. 20 years ago, everybody was still getting their head around this web thing, and we had dial-up as the most common way of connecting to the internet. Today, we have phones that are instantly connected to the internet. In fact, we don't even think about it, it becomes like a weird thing then if you're taking a road trip and you're driving across the state of Kansas and you lose internet connection for your phone. It's like, what happened? I mean, and am I in a third world? And so that's kind of where we're at today. Is just the pace of innovation is happening faster than it ever has, and that's why a lot of people talk about this being the fourth industrial revolution.
Absolutely. Well, Matthew, I want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your philosophies with all of us today. And anybody looking for expertise around any of these subjects, look up Matthew David, the author Matthew David. You can go to Amazon.com, I imagine, and find some of your books.
Yeah, I got a few up there.
All right. So look at his library of authored books. Download them. Matthew would appreciate it, and and you can reach out to him from there. So I want to thank you, Matthew, for sharing with us, and I want to thank everyone out there for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on your show, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.